Keith, you yourself were a CEO at one point of a pretty sizable enterprise. So let's say we're not talking about the everyman here. Let's say we're talking about people who are business leaders, perhaps presidents or CEOs of corporations. What can and should they do in this situation?
But I believe nobody should bend a knee to the Chinese Communist Party. We clearly have the moral high ground here. So I think pulling businesses out of that Xinjiang region, number one. But I also think, too, in terms of investing in these companies, we put out a list, 1,200 companies and subsidiaries at the State Department that either participate in Chinese military civil fusion or human rights abuse or the surveillance state. And these are companies that should be divested from. And what Ellie was talking about, in terms of asking your pension fund manager, in terms of asking your financial manager, in terms of if you donate to a foundation or to a university endowment, you really want to find this out and put the pressure on them because genocide is going on right now. And that was the point of the op-ed, because we wrote it, very close to the time of the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and really to honor the survivors and those who've passed as well, to never forget them and to honor them by preventing it in the future. And it's going on now. And, we failed to stop it last century, and we really need to do something about it again. And as Ellie and I say, when we say never again, we must mean it.
You were actually sanctioned minutes after the new administration took power. And so what has been the actual cost? What has been the impact of that?
Well, it was interesting because I was being interviewed on TV the day before the sanctions, the second to last day of the administration. They said, well, Keith, you might get sanctioned. And I said, well, I am sure I already am. A lot of people talk about it as a badge of honor. I think it is a result of the results we got with things like the Clean Network, what we did in terms of our sanctions, our financial sanctions. One of the things that I was responsible for. And I don't think anybody should bend a knee to the Chinese Communist Party. So, so be it. My family and I, we can't go to China, those kind of things. But I think one of the big things is this was a shot across the bow to the next administration, to folks like Secretary of State Blinken, to folks like Kurt Campbell, who's heading up a lot of the China stuff at the National Security Council. Because, when you're in a position and you're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, as we saw in Alaska, just, this weekend, you can't hesitate. And these guys are going to come after us. Now, I happen to think that they're actually dealing from a position of weakness, because as I traveled around, 40 countries over the last few months, I could see that citizens of the world have woken up to the Chinese Communist Party's, I call it their 3 C's doctrine of concealment, co-option, and coercion. And citizens of the world now understand that the pandemic is a result of the concealment of the virus. Citizens of the world have seen that the evisceration of Hong Kong's freedom is a result of that co-option of Hong Kong. Citizens of the world now understand and are beginning to hear about how the coercion in Xinjiang has grown into genocide. And these citizens don't like it.
Ellie, maybe you can talk about this a little bit. There's, of course, these sanctions we were talking about earlier, coordinated across Western democracies and the EU. The CCP, Chinese Communist Party, responded with something like, I heard someone said, and I haven't counted myself, so I can't fact check this, but it was like 4-1 for every one that was sanctioned in China. 4 officials were sanctioned in the EU. And that's up from all sorts of walks of life. And I think that's pretty fascinating, because the EU, not too recently, was ready to sign a massive investment deal, which to my eye looked like didn't have a ton of accountability. So your thoughts?
Yeah, Jan, I think the Chinese approach is disingenuous at best. They're kind of just trying to, they're trying their best to fool the international community about what's going on in China, right? And they're trying to point fingers elsewhere. So so first of all, to your point about sanctioning American officials and EU officials, I think the fact that former Undersecretary Kroc was the third person on the list on the day that first round of sanctions was announced is truly a badge of honor. I think that the Undersecretary was able to then leave government knowing that he accomplished much. Anyone who gets sanctioned, quote unquote, by China should understand it is that they're doing good work, that they have been effective because the Chinese are in essence coming after them. But to talk a little bit about how the Chinese try to fool the world and kind of spread this propaganda, the meeting that took place last week in Alaska with Secretary Blinken, when the Secretary of State of the United States was speaking exactly on our topic, which is this genocide taking place in China, the Chinese diplomats, their retort was to talk about BLM riots in the United States. Any thinking individual knows there's no comparison there. I really would encourage any American who receives this kind of nonsensical response from Chinese officials into the future to really kind of throw that right back at their face. Because, we're talking about punishable genocide. We're talking about the most heinous human rights violations being committed by the Chinese Communist Party. And there's just no comparison to anything going on in this great United States of America. And anyone who would dare to say otherwise is just lying through their teeth. And so we can't put up with that kind of nonsense.
You mentioned, Keith, this bipartisanship. How best can this be moved along in a bipartisan manner, do you imagine?
Well, I think so much is being done on Capitol Hill on that already. I mean, the resolutions have passed. I think that's going great. I think it's now to take it out and spread it out from there. Clearly, an executive branch, it is right now. But it's really, our Congress, men and women, and our senators, they're interfacing with leaders all the time from around the world and their colleagues. So I think that is a big important area because I think the world has woken up. And, the interesting thing about the Clean Network was that we exposed their biggest weakness. It was trust. So the number one premise of the Clean Network is trust principles, that it operates by trust principles. It's things like integrity, reciprocity, transparency, respect for rule of law, respect for property of all kinds, respect for sovereignty of nation, respect for the planet, and respect for human rights. And what was interesting for me is in my, I would say in the first few months, I had about 60 bilaterals with my colleagues, foreign ministers, finance ministers, economic ministers, their deputies. And when, I'd ask them about China, how's your relationship going? They, they would always go, well, they're important. They're number one, number two trading partner. And then they look both ways and they lean in and they'd say, but we don't trust them. And all I know is that trust is the most important word in any language. It's the basis for every relationship, personal, business, or otherwise. And that's the thing, is that nobody trusts the Chinese Communist Party. That is something that we can use to our advantage when it comes to things like the Chinese Communist Party perpetrating genocide or what they're doing in terms of their surveillance state and all those other horrific things. And this has formed out a movement and a foundation. And I think it's really important to remember that. It kind of gets back to what Ellie was talking about, in the Alaska meeting. And that is when you realize you're coming from that position of weakness, you've got that insecurity. You're like cornered. You lurch out. And that's what a bully does. And, bully does things like sanction guys like me and everybody else for doing their job. And, all I know is when you confront a bully, they back down. And they really, really back down when you have your friends by your side. And there is strength in numbers and there's power in unity and solidarity. And that security blanket is what made the Clean Network such a success.
Any final thoughts before we finish up?
Jan, I really just want to emphasize that for 76 years following the Holocaust, we've said never again. And we're in a moment right now when we're confronted with a situation where it's the test of if we meant it and if we mean it. And the reality is it's not too late. Today's the day. People can take action. I encourage everyone to do so. And I know that the American people want to, and we want to really mean never again. We want to mean it when we say it.
Well, give me a quick recap of what folks can do. And I know you've already kind of outlined a number of things in the episode, but maybe we can start with Ellie and we can finish up with Keith. What can people do actively now?
Sure. I think first of all, educate yourselves. Just read about the atrocities. It'll break your heart. It'll bring you to tears. Second of all, I encourage everyone to pick up the phone. Please call every fund manager that you might have a relationship. So whether it's your brokerage company, if you're an alumni of a university, call the alumni office and talk to them about this issue. If you're in a pension fund, and basically any kind of a fund that you might be invested in, because you don't want to be invested in China Inc. So pick up that phone and demand transparency. And if they're not, if your broker or the fund representative is not willing to share information about where you're invested, then it might be time to look elsewhere.
And what about, a little bit at a larger scale for those folks that are running companies, nonprofits, other organizations?
So if you look at these big nonprofits and civil society, these are powerful voices, and to shout it from the mountaintop. A great example is the International Olympic Committee. They operate under the highest principles, and now we're about ready to have the Olympics in 2022. I think that should be really up for debate. Or if you look at the World Economic Forum, the gathering of all the global CEOs and then also the government leaders. I mean, put it on the agenda, at least talk about it. And these asset managers who can control trillions and trillions of dollars, this is the time if you're going to make a statement. They've done a great job on the environment, but when it comes to human rights and let alone genocide, they haven't done anything. And the whole ESG community is a powerful group, one that has a great human heart. They really have a powerful voice. And for CEOs, make sure your supply chains are clean. And for the financial institutions, it's incumbent on you. You have a moral responsibility and a fiduciary duty to disclose if you're invested in Chinese companies, and particularly ones that are involved in the surveillance state or human rights abuses or military civil fusion. And especially if they involve like an emerging index fund, like the MSCI Emerging Index Fund or the FTSE Emerging Index Fund, because these index funds have, as of last June, just added 250 Chinese companies into that mix. What's really sad is that the average American investor is unknowingly financing the Chinese Communist Party, human rights abuses, surveillance state, and their military civil fusion. And it's buried in these index funds, which are then in all kinds of products, hundreds and hundreds of products in ETFs and in mutual funds. So the biggest thing is transparency. Once again, if we're going to shine the light of transparency on Xinjiang, we've got to shine it on ourselves.
So could someone, for example, download this sheet of companies that are, basically complicit to a lot of these violations and, send it to their manager and say, I want to be sure that none of these companies are in my fund, for example? Is that the sort of thing you're suggesting?
Absolutely, because there's 1,200 companies and subsidiaries that are on the Pentagon list, and that's for military civil fusion. One of the things also that I recommended in my last press conference is there's 500 Chinese companies that are on the Commerce Department's entity list. Now, these companies are so bad, we're saying we're not exporting any technology to them. And of those, only 7 are on the Pentagon list. And so it's one of my recommendations, I think, is continuity of policy to actually fix that. I wish we would have had time to do that, but I think the Biden administration is going to be on that and perhaps make it mandatory by putting it on the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And the other thing that we did on the fact sheet is we tracked these index funds, how many have divested from these companies. And they've divested a few, but they got a long way to go. And I think it's good to keep the pressure on them and to keep our eyes on them.
Well, Deputy Envoy Kohanim, Undersecretary Crotch, such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
Jan, thanks so much for having Ellie and myself on. We appreciate this opportunity.